Evan Carter had spent 2 years protecting his fragile daughter from every danger in the world, until the night a drowning woman asked him the one question that terrified him most. Would you stay if you saw who I really am? He'd already lost one person he loved. He'd already learned that staying meant watching the people you need slowly disappear. But when Sophie's fever spiked and the woman with scars waited alone in an empty penthouse, Evan discovered that the hardest promises aren't made with words. They're proven in the moments when everything falls apart. If you want to see how a single father's split-second decision by a dark river changed 3 broken lives forever, stay with me until the end. And please, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The October wind off the Ravenport River carried the smell of coming winter, that sharp, clean scent that warned of frost and early darkness. Evan Carter walked with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his daughter Sophie's small hand tucked safely in his left one, her fingers barely reaching past his palm. At 7 years old, she was small for her age, delicate in ways that made his chest tight every time he looked at her. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate?" Sophie's voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if asking for something warm was too much to request. "Sure, kiddo." Evan squeezed her hand gently. "After we get home. I'll make the kind with the little marshmallows you like." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went quiet again. She was always quiet after her therapy appointments, the kind of quiet that came from spending an hour talking about feelings she was too young to fully understand. Grief. Loss. The permanent absence of a mother who would never come back no matter how many times Sophie wished otherwise. Evan knew that quiet. He lived in it every day. The Riverside path was nearly empty at this hour, just past 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. Most people were home already, settling into dinner routines and television schedules. Evan preferred it this way. The solitude, the rhythm of their footsteps on the concrete path, the distant sound of water moving steadily toward the harbor. It gave him space to breathe, to exist without the weight of other people's sympathetic looks or well-meaning questions about how he was managing. He wasn't managing. He was surviving. There was a difference. Sophie tugged on his hand. "Dad, look, the lights!" Across the river, the downtown skyline was beginning to glow as office buildings switched on their evening illumination. Ravenport wasn't a large city, but it had enough corporate presence to create a respectable skyline. Banking headquarters, insurance companies, a handful of tech firms that had migrated north from Boston looking for cheaper real estate and tax incentives. Evan had grown up looking at those buildings, knowing they represented a world he'd never be part of. He'd finished high school, done a year of community college before his father got sick, and then life had simply happened in the way it does when you're too busy keeping your head above water to plan for any kind of future. He'd worked construction, then building maintenance, eventually landing a steady position as a facilities supervisor at Ravenport General Hospital. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and offered health insurance, which mattered more than anything else when you had a daughter with a heart condition. "They're pretty," Sophie said, still watching the lights. "Yeah, they are." "Do you think Mom can see them from where she is?" Evan's throat tightened. These questions came without warning, always when he least expected them. "I think if there's any way she can, she does. She always loved the river at night." It wasn't a lie. His wife Lauren had loved this path, had insisted on evening walks even when she was too tired from treatment to make it more than halfway. She'd been the one who turned their small life into something that felt bigger than it was, who'd made hospital cafeteria coffee taste like an adventure, who'd convinced Sophie that being small meant you could see details other people missed. And then she died, and Evan had been left to figure out how to be both parents to a daughter whose heart was literally too weak for the weight of losing her mother. They walked in comfortable silence for another few minutes, following the curve of the path as it bent away from downtown and toward the older residential areas where Evan's apartment sat above a bakery that opened at 5 every morning. He'd learned to sleep through the smell of rising dough. Then he heard the scream. It wasn't loud, more of a sharp cut-off cry that could have been surprise or fear or pain. Evan's head snapped up, his body already moving toward the sound before his brain fully processed what he'd heard. Ahead on the path, maybe 50 yards, he could see a figure near the embankment, the weak glow of the path lights catching on something dark and professional. A coat, maybe, or a suit jacket. "Sophie, stay right here," Evan's voice came out harder than he intended, the command of a father who needed immediate obedience. Don't move from this spot. I mean it. Dad, stay here. He ran. The embankment at this section of the path dropped steeply to the water, the bank slick with mud and wet leaves that had been accumulating since September. The river was running high this time of year, swollen with recent rain and moving fast enough to be dangerous. Evan knew this stretch, had walked it hundreds of times, knew exactly how treacherous it could be in poor light. As he got closer, he saw what had happened. A woman, professional clothing, expensive shoes that had no grip on wet surfaces, had slipped on the embankment and slid straight down into the river. He could see her in the water, maybe 10 feet from the bank, her arms flailing as the current pulled at her, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to scream and got water instead of air. She was drowning. Right there, 50 feet from a well-lit path, she was drowning. Evan didn't think. He kicked off his shoes, shrugged out of his jacket, and dove. The water hit him like a physical blow so cold it knocked the air from his lungs. The Ravenport River in October was barely above 40 degrees, fed by mountain runoff that hadn't had time to warm even in the autumn sun. It was the kind of cold that seized your muscles, that made your heart stutter and your brain slow down. Evan forced himself to move. He was a strong swimmer, had been on the swim team in high school before life got complicated, but this wasn't a pool with lane lines and warm water. This was a river with a current that wanted to pull him downstream and a temperature that wanted to shut his body down. The woman had gone under. Evan could see the dark shape of her below the surface, her arms still moving but weaker now, more random. He pulled himself through the water with powerful strokes, fighting the current, fighting the cold, fighting every instinct that told him to turn back and get to safety. He reached her just as she stopped moving. Evan grabbed her jacket, yanked her head above water, and locked his arm across her chest the way he'd learned in the lifeguard certification course he'd taken years ago. She was dead weight, not fighting him, possibly not conscious. He kicked hard, aiming for the bank, feeling the current try to pull them both downstream. His muscles screamed. The cold was making him clumsy, his movements less coordinated with each passing second. He could feel his body starting to shut down, could feel the dangerous lethargy that came before hypothermia. But he could also feel the woman's chest moving against his arm, could feel the faint flutter of her heartbeat, and he held on. The bank seemed impossibly far away, then closer. Then his feet hit mud. Evan dragged them both out of the water up the slick embankment, using roots and rocks for handholds. The woman was coughing now, choking up river water, her whole body convulsing with the effort. He got her onto the path and immediately rolled her onto her side, supporting her head as she vomited water and bile onto the concrete. "Sophie!" His voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable. He could see his daughter running toward them, her face white with fear. "Sophie, call 911. My phone. In my jacket pocket." But the woman was shaking her head, still coughing but forcing words out between spasms. "No. No hospital, please. You need medical attention. You were underwater. No." She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her wet hair hanging in her face. "Please, I can't go to a hospital. Please." Evan stared at her. Even in the weak light, he could see she was shaking violently, could see the way her hands were white-knuckled against the concrete. This wasn't just about the cold. This was something else, something deeper. Sophie reached them, Evan's jacket clutched in her small hands. "Dad, are you okay? You're bleeding." He looked down. His hands were torn up from the embankment, scraped raw from rocks and roots. He hadn't even felt it. "I'm fine, kiddo. It's okay." The woman lifted her head, and for the first time, Evan got a clear look at her face. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered to her skull and eyes that looked almost black in the shadows. Her makeup was running down her face in dark streams, and her expensive suit was ruined, covered in mud and river water. "Thank you." Her voice was steadier now, though still shaking. "Thank you for... I don't know how to..." "Don't." Evan pulled off his wet shirt, wrung it out, and handed it to Sophie. "Use this to dry your hands, Soph, and stay warm." He turned back to the woman. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. You need to get warm. If you won't go to the hospital, at least let me call someone. Family? Friends?" She shook her head. "No one. There's no one." Something in the way she said it made Evan pause. He understood that tone. He'd used it himself. That flat certainty that came from knowing you were alone in ways that went beyond physical presence. Sophie tugged on his arm. Dad, she needs help. We can't just leave her. Evan looked at his daughter, this small, fragile girl who'd lost so much already, but somehow still had room in her heart to worry about a stranger. Then he looked at the woman shivering on the path, at her expensive clothes and her haunted eyes, and he made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, can you walk? The woman nodded, though when she tried to stand, her legs nearly gave out. Evan caught her, supporting her weight easily despite his own exhaustion. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe he was running on adrenaline, his body not yet registering the full extent of what he'd just done. There's a coffee shop 3 blocks from here, Evan said. We can get you warm, get you dried off. Then we figure out next steps. I have a car. The woman's voice was barely above a whisper. In the parking lot. Back that way. If you could help me get to it. Evan hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. Felt like more than just a woman who'd slipped on a wet embankment. But Sophie was looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, and the woman was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering, and he couldn't just walk away. All right, he said. Let's get you to your car. They made it to the parking lot in slow, painful increments. The woman, she still hadn't offered her name, leaned heavily on Evan, her breathing shallow and rapid. Sophie walked close on Evan's other side, her small hand gripping his belt loop, anchoring herself to him. The car was a black Mercedes, sleek and expensive, the kind of vehicle Evan saw in the hospital executive parking lot but never paid much attention to. The woman fumbled in her jacket pocket, pulled out keys with shaking hands, and clicked the unlock button. The headlights flashed once. I can drive you somewhere, Evan offered. You're in no condition. I can manage. She pulled open the driver's door, paused, then turned to face him fully. In the parking lot lights, he could see her face more clearly. Sharp cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes that looked like they'd seen things she wished they hadn't. You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same. No. She shook her head slowly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and waited. You jumped in. You didn't hesitate. Evan didn't know what to say to that. He'd acted on instinct, on the same protective impulse that governed every decision he made where Sophie was concerned. He hadn't thought about being brave or heroic. He just thought about a person drowning and how he couldn't let that happen. The woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face to Sophie's and back again. I'm Claire, she said finally. Claire Whitmore. The name meant nothing to Evan, though he had the vague sense it should. Evan Carter. This is my daughter, Sophie. Sophie gave a small wave. Are you going to be okay? Claire's expression softened slightly. I think so. Thanks to your dad. Do you need anything? Evan asked. Water? A blanket? No, I just need to get home. Claire climbed into the car, moving stiffly, then paused again. This is going to sound strange, but would you come with me? Just until I'm inside. I don't want to be alone right now. Every rational part of Evan's brain told him this was a bad idea. He didn't know this woman. He had Sophie to think about. They were both soaking wet and cold, and they needed to get home to dry clothes and hot showers. But he looked at Claire's face, at the fear there that had nothing to do with drowning, and he heard himself say, okay, just until you're inside. Claire lived in Harbor Point, the most expensive neighborhood in Ravenport, where old money met new development, and the result was glass towers with waterfront views and security systems that cost more than Evan made in a year. The building's parking garage required a key card for access, and the elevator up to the residential floors required another one. Sophie pressed close to Evan's side, her eyes wide as she took in the marble floors and modern art installations in the lobby. Dad, she whispered, is she rich? Probably, Evan whispered back. Claire's penthouse was on the 23rd floor, the top floor, as it turned out, accessed by a private elevator that opened directly into her entryway. The apartment was massive, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture, the kind of space that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine rather than being lived in. There are towels in the bathroom down the hall, Claire said, her voice still shaking. And I can find some dry clothes for... She looked at Sophie, seemed to struggle with what to offer a 7-year-old girl. I might have something that would work. We're fine, Evan said. We'll wait here while you get changed. Then we'll go. But Claire didn't move toward the bedroom. She stood in the middle of her living room, dripping water onto expensive hardwood, her arms wrapped around herself. She was still shaking, though the apartment was warm enough that Evan could feel his own body starting to thaw. Claire? Evan took a step toward her. You need to get out of those wet clothes. I know. She didn't look at him. I know I do. It's just... She stopped, shook her head. Never mind, it's stupid. It's not stupid. Evan kept his voice gentle, the same tone he used when Sophie woke from nightmares. You almost died tonight. That's not something you just shake off. Claire laughed, but it was a bitter sound, sharp and painful. I wasn't talking about drowning. Evan waited. Sophie had settled onto the edge of a cream-colored sofa, her legs not quite reaching the floor, her eyes moving between the adults with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read emotional weather. Claire turned to face them, and Evan saw tears mixing with the river water still dripping from her hair. I need to show you something, she said quietly. And then you'll leave. Everyone always leaves when they see. See what? Instead of answering, Claire reached up and began unbuttoning her ruined suit jacket. Evan started to turn away to give her privacy, but she shook her head. No, you need to see this. You need to understand why I can't go to a hospital. She shrugged out of the jacket, then pulled off the silk blouse underneath. She stood there in her soaked bra and slacks, and Evan's breath caught in his throat. Scars. Massive, terrible scars that covered her left shoulder, ran down her arm, spread across her ribs. The kind of scars that came from burns, from fire, that had melted skin and left permanent damage. The kind of scars that spoke of pain Evan couldn't imagine. I was 8, Claire said, her voice flat now, emotionless. House fire. My father tried to get me out. He succeeded, obviously, but not before... She gestured at her scarred skin. Not before this. Sophie had gone very still on the sofa, her eyes fixed on Claire with an intensity that made Evan's chest tight. His daughter understood scars. She had one herself, running down her chest from the heart surgery she'd had at 5, the operation that had bought her time but not cured her. People say they don't care, Claire continued. They say scars don't matter, that it's what's inside that counts. But they lie. They always lie. The first time something gets hard, the first time I'm not perfect in every other way to make up for being broken in this one, they leave. Every single time. Evan stood frozen, Sophie's small hand suddenly in his, anchoring him. He thought about his wife, about watching her body deteriorate through rounds of chemotherapy that poisoned her trying to save her. He thought about the friends who'd promised to be there but slowly faded away when it became clear Lauren wasn't going to get better. He thought about the loneliness of being the one who stayed while everyone else found reasons to go. Would you? Claire asked, and her voice cracked on the words. Would you stay? If you saw who I really am? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with more weight than just the scars she was showing him. This was about more than physical damage. This was about fear that lived in the bones, that whispered, you're too broken to love, too damaged to keep. Evan knew that fear. He felt it every time Sophie got sick, every time her heart monitor beeped wrong at her checkups, every time he woke at 3 in the morning and checked to make sure she was still breathing. He felt it every time someone looked at him with that particular brand of pity reserved for single fathers who'd lost their wives too young. I don't know, he said honestly, and Claire's face crumpled. Wait, let me finish. I don't know because I don't know you, but I know that scars don't scare me. I know that being broken doesn't make you less. And I know that the only thing I've ever been sure of in my entire life is that I stay. No matter what. That's what I do. Claire stared at him, tears running freely now. You don't understand. No one ever stays. Not when things get hard. Not when... Evan's phone rang. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, sharp and insistent. Evan fumbled for it, his wet fingers slipping on the screen. The caller ID showed Sophie's pediatrician's emergency line. His heart stopped. I have to take this. He didn't wait for Claire's response. Dr. Patterson, what's wrong? The words came through the phone in a rush, clinical and terrifying. Fever, heart rate, emergency protocols. Sophie had been fine an hour ago, walking beside him on the river path, but that was before the icy water, before the stress, before... I'm coming. Evan was already moving, pulling Sophie up from the sofa. 20 minutes. I'm coming right now. He hung up and looked at Claire, who was standing there half-dressed, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say something that would make this make sense, but Sophie's hand was hot in his, too hot, fever hot, and nothing else mattered. I'm sorry, he said. We have to go, right now. What's wrong? Claire's voice was sharp now, focused. Is she? Fever. Her heart. I have to get her to the hospital. Evan was moving toward the elevator, Sophie stumbling to keep up with him. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The elevator doors opened. Evan stepped inside. Sophie pressed against his side, and he turned back to see Claire standing alone in her enormous apartment, wet and scarred, and looking more broken than she had in the river. Thank you, she said quietly, for pulling me out. The doors closed before Evan could respond. The elevator descended, taking them away from that strange moment of vulnerability, away from Claire Whitmore and her scars and her question that he hadn't been able to answer. Sophie's hand tightened in his. Dad, I don't feel good. I know, baby. I know. We're going to the hospital. Dr. Patterson is going to take care of you. But as the elevator reached the ground floor and they rushed out into the cold October night, Evan couldn't stop thinking about the look on Claire's face when his phone rang, that expression of resigned understanding, as if she'd been expecting it, as if she'd known all along that the moment would come when he would have to leave. Everyone always leaves when things get hard. He'd wanted to tell her that wasn't true. He'd wanted to prove it somehow. But Sophie's fever was spiking, and his daughter's survival was the only promise he'd made that mattered more than anything else. Behind them, 23 floors up, Claire Whitmore stood alone in her apartment, still dripping water onto expensive floors, and wondered if she'd been right all along about people only staying when it was easy. The question remained unanswered between them, suspended in the space of what might have been if one man's phone hadn't rung at exactly the wrong moment, or maybe exactly the right one. Would you stay if you saw who I really am? Evan didn't know. But as he buckled Sophie into their old Honda and pointed it toward the hospital, he understood something about Claire that he hadn't before. She wasn't asking about scars. She was asking about the weight of being someone who needed more than people were willing to give. She was asking if anyone would choose to carry that weight. And he'd left her standing there alone, which was probably all the answer she'd needed. The fluorescent lights of Ravenport General's emergency department buzzed with that particular frequency that lived somewhere between sound and headache. Evan had spent enough time in these corridors to know every flickering bulb, every worn spot on the linoleum, every place where the walls showed the ghosts of old signage that had been painted over but never quite disappeared. Sophie lay on the examination bed with her eyes closed, her small chest rising and falling too quickly, her skin flushed with fever that had climbed to 103.7 by the time they'd arrived. The nurse had taken her vitals 3 times, each reading confirming what Evan already knew in his gut. His daughter's fragile heart was struggling under the stress of infection and cold exposure. Mr. Carter? Dr. Patricia Patterson pushed through the curtain, her reading glasses perched on top of her head, her expression carefully neutral in the way that made Evan's stomach drop. She'd been Sophie's cardiologist since the diagnosis 3 years ago, had held Evan's hand through more scares than he could count, and he'd learned to read every micro-expression on her face. This one said, trouble. How bad? Evan stood from the plastic chair he'd been occupying, moving closer to Sophie's bed without thinking about it. His protective instinct was a living thing, always reaching for his daughter. Dr. Patterson pulled out her tablet, swiped through screens of data that meant nothing to Evan but everything to her trained eyes. Her heart rate is elevated, 145 at rest. Combined with the fever and what you described about the cold water exposure, we're looking at significant stress on an already compromised system. But she wasn't in the water. I kept her on the path. She stayed dry. The cold air, the stress of watching you in danger, the rushing to get here, all of it adds up. Dr. Patterson moved to Sophie's side, placed a gentle hand on her forehead. "Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Sophie's eyes fluttered open. "Tired, and my chest hurts." Those 3 words, "my chest hurts," never failed to turn Evan's blood to ice. Sophie had been born with a congenital heart defect, a malformation of her left ventricle that meant her heart had to work twice as hard to pump blood through her small body. The surgery at 5 had helped, had bought them time, but Dr. Patterson had been clear from the beginning. This wasn't cured, only managed. Sophie would need monitoring for the rest of her life, possible future surgeries, careful attention to any illness that might stress her cardiovascular system. And here they were, in the ER at 7:30 on a Wednesday night, because Evan had jumped into a freezing river without thinking about what it might cost his daughter to watch. "I need to admit her," Dr. Patterson said quietly, pulling Evan aside while a nurse began setting up an IV line. "At minimum overnight observation, possibly longer depending on how she responds to treatment. We need to get the fever down and monitor her cardiac function. If her heart rate doesn't stabilize, what happens if it doesn't stabilize?" Dr. Patterson met his eyes, and Evan saw the truth there before she spoke it. "Then we're looking at potential cardiac distress, arrhythmia. In the worst-case scenario, heart failure." The words landed like physical blows. Heart failure. His 7-year-old daughter. Heart failure. "But we're not there yet," Dr. Patterson continued, her voice firm now, pulling Evan back from the edge of panic. "Right now, we're treating the fever and monitoring closely. Kids are resilient, Evan. Sophie's been through worse than this." Had she? Evan couldn't remember worse than this, couldn't remember a time when the possibility of losing her had felt quite this immediate, quite this real. When Lauren died, it had been terrible, devastating, world-ending, but it had also been expected. The cancer had given them time to prepare, to say goodbye, to make peace with the inevitable. This was different. This was Sophie, who'd been fine this morning, who'd eaten her cereal and complained about her math homework and asked if they could get a dog someday. This was his daughter, the only person left in the world who made his life mean something beyond just surviving from one day to the next. "Dad?" Sophie's voice was small, scared. "Am I going to have to stay here?" Evan crossed back to her bedside, took her small hand in his much larger one. Her fingers were still too warm, her pulse fluttering against his palm like a trapped bird. "Just for a little bit, kiddo, just until you feel better." "But what about school tomorrow? I have my book report due." "School can wait. Your book report can wait. Right now, you just need to rest and let the doctors take care of you." Sophie's lower lip trembled. "I don't want to stay here. I want to go home." I know you do." Evan smoothed her hair back from her forehead, feeling the heat radiating from her skin. "But sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do because they're the right thing. Remember what Mom used to say? Brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what you need to do even when you are scared," Sophie finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember." The nurse finished setting up the IV, hung a bag of fluids, and started the drip. "This should help bring the fever down," she said kindly. "And we've got some medicine in here that'll make your heart feel better too." Sophie nodded, her eyes already starting to droop. The fever was exhausting her, pulling her down into sleep even as her heart raced too fast in her chest. "Mr. Carter, we need to get some paperwork sorted," Dr. Patterson said. "Can you step out for just a moment?" Evan hesitated, unwilling to leave Sophie even for a second, but she was asleep now, her breathing evening out slightly, and the nurse was sitting beside her with a watchful eye on the monitors. He followed Dr. Patterson into the hallway. "I need to be honest with you about something," she said once they were out of Sophie's earshot. "Her heart function has been declining over the past 6 months. Not dramatically, not enough to warrant immediate intervention, but the trend is concerning. This kind of acute stress, it could accelerate things." "What are you saying? She needs another surgery?" "Possibly. Not immediately, but within the next year or two, we may be looking at more extensive intervention. I wanted you to be prepared for that possibility." Evan leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. More surgery, more hospitals, more nights like this one, wondering if his daughter would make it to morning. He'd been a single parent for 2 years, had thought he'd figured out how to handle the constant low-grade terror of keeping Sophie alive and healthy. But this? This was beyond his capacity to manage. How much? The question came out flat, emotionless. The surgery. How much does something like that cost? Dr. Patterson's expression softened with sympathy. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We don't know if it'll be necessary. And your insurance through the hospital covers 80%, I know, but 20% of what? 100,000? 200,000? Evan laughed, but it was a broken sound. I have maybe 12,000 in savings. That's it. That's everything I've managed to put away since Lauren died. There are programs, financial assistance. We can work with you. I know. You've told me before. Evan pushed off from the wall, needing to move, needing to do something with the helpless rage building in his chest. I'm sorry. I know you're trying to help. I just feel so powerless, Dr. Patterson finished. I understand. But Evan, you're not powerless. You got her here. You kept her safe. You're doing everything right. But he didn't feel like he was doing everything right. He felt like he'd failed, like jumping into that river had been a selfish act that put his daughter at risk. If he'd just called 911, if he'd waited for professionals, Sophie would be home right now instead of hooked up to an IV in the emergency department. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message from his supervisor at the hospital, asking if he'd be in for his shift tomorrow morning. Evan had completely forgotten about work, about the obligations that didn't stop just because his daughter was sick. He typed back a quick response, family emergency, need coverage, and shoved the phone back in his pocket without waiting for a reply. Go sit with her, Dr. Patterson said gently. She'll sleep better if you're there. I'll have the nurse come get you when we're ready to transfer her to a room upstairs. Evan nodded and pushed back through the curtain. Sophie was exactly as he'd left her, small and fragile in the oversized hospital bed, the IV line snaking from her arm to the bag of fluids hanging above her. He settled back into the plastic chair, pulled it as close to the bed as it would go, and took her hand again. The hours passed in that strange hospital time that felt both endless and compressed, minutes stretching like taffy while simultaneously disappearing into nothing. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medications, offering Evan coffee he didn't want, and sandwiches he couldn't eat. Dr. Patterson returned twice, her expression slightly less worried each time as Sophie's fever began to respond to treatment. By midnight, they'd moved Sophie to a room on the pediatric floor, a small space with cartoon animals painted on the walls and a fold-out chair that was supposed to pass for a bed for parents spending the night. Evan didn't bother trying to sleep. He sat beside Sophie's bed and watched the monitor above her head, watched the green line of her heartbeat spike and settle. Spike and settle. Too fast, but steady. His phone buzzed again. Another text. This one from a number he didn't recognize. This is Claire Whitmore. I got your number from the hospital directory. I hope that's not too invasive. I wanted to check on your daughter. Is she all right? Evan stared at the message for a long moment, trying to reconcile the reality of Claire Whitmore with the surreal events of a few hours ago. The river, the scars, the question he hadn't answered before his world tilted sideways. He typed back, she's stable. Fever from stress on her heart. They're keeping her overnight. The response came almost immediately. I'm sorry, that must be terrifying. It is. A pause, then, is there anything I can do? Anything you need? Evan almost laughed. What he needed was a new heart for his daughter, a medical system that didn't bankrupt families trying to keep sick children alive, a world where 7-year-olds didn't have to be brave in the face of heart failure. But what he typed was, thank you, but we're okay. Another pause, longer this time. Then, the question I asked you earlier about staying, you don't have to answer it. I shouldn't have put that on you. Evan looked at Sophie, at the rise and fall of her chest, at the monitors tracking her fragile heart. He thought about Claire standing alone in her penthouse, wrapped in her scars and her certainty that everyone always left. He thought about how he'd proven her right without meaning to, how he'd run when she'd finally been vulnerable enough to show him her broken places. He typed, I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. There's a difference. Is there? From where I'm standing, the result looks the same. Evan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to explain, to make her understand that some obligations were absolute, that some promises couldn't be broken no matter what. But how could he explain the weight of being a single parent to someone who'd said there was no one? To someone who lived alone in that enormous apartment with nothing but scars and silence? "My daughter is everything," he typed finally. "She's the only thing that matters. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but it's the truth. When she needs me, nothing else exists." That's not harsh. That's what staying looks like. The words hit Evan hard, knocked something loose in his chest. He'd been so focused on the fact that he'd left Claire standing there that he hadn't thought about what it meant that he'd stayed with Sophie through every impossible thing, that leaving her had never once been an option no matter how hard it got. Maybe that was what Claire had been asking all along. Not whether he'd stay with her, but whether he understood what it meant to stay at all. "I should let you focus on your daughter," Claire's next message read. "But if you need anything, and I mean anything, please ask. I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything." "That's where you're wrong, but we can argue about it another time." Evan set his phone down and went back to watching Sophie sleep. The conversation with Claire felt like something from another lifetime, disconnected from the reality of hospital rooms and heart monitors and the constant fear that lived in his bones. But something about it had settled something in him too, had reminded him that he did know how to stay, that he'd been doing it every day for 2 years, even when it would have been easier to fall apart. The night stretched on. Sophie woke once around 3 in the morning, confused and scared, and Evan talked her back to sleep with stories about her mother, about the time Lauren had convinced him to go ice skating, even though he'd never been, and had spent the entire afternoon falling on his ass while she laughed and spun circles around him. "She was beautiful when she laughed," Sophie murmured, her eyes already closing again. "I remember." "Yeah, she was. She really was. Do you think she'd be proud of me? For being brave?" Evan's throat closed up. "I know she would be. I know she is." Sophie nodded and drifted back to sleep, her hand still wrapped around Evan's fingers. He sat there in the dark, listening to the beep of the heart monitor, listening to his daughter breathe, and felt the weight of every promise he'd ever made. When dawn finally broke through the window, painting the hospital room in shades of gray and gold, Dr. Patterson appeared in the doorway with her tablet and her reading glasses and an expression that made Evan's heart stutter. "Her fever broke," she said without preamble. "Heart rate is still elevated but trending down. If this continues through the morning, we can probably send her home this afternoon." The relief was so intense it was almost painful. "She's going to be okay?" "For now, yes. But Evan, we need to talk about long-term management. What happened last night?" The stress response. "The way her heart reacted to the fever, it's concerning. We need to be more aggressive with monitoring, possibly adjust her medications. And you need to avoid situations that put that kind of acute stress on her system." "I know. I wasn't thinking. I just saw someone drowning, and you did what any decent person would do. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying that moving forward, you need to factor Sophie's limitations into your decisions. She can't handle the kind of stress that would be manageable for other kids her age." Evan nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle back onto his shoulders. Every decision filtered through the lens of Sophie's health, every choice measured against the risk to her heart. It was exhausting, relentless, the constant calculation of what might hurt her versus what she needed to live any kind of normal life. "I understand," he said quietly. Dr. Patterson's expression softened. "I know you do, and I know it's not fair that you shouldn't have to carry all of this alone. Have you thought about the support group I mentioned? Other single parents dealing with kids who have chronic conditions?" "I don't have time for support groups." "You don't have time not to, Evan. You're going to burn out if you keep trying to do this all by yourself." But Evan didn't know how to do it any other way. He'd been doing it by himself since Lauren died, had learned to be both mother and father, to be the strong one and the soft one, to be everything Sophie needed because there was no one else to share the load. Sophie stirred in the bed, her eyes opening slowly. "Dad, is it morning?" "Yeah, kiddo, it's morning, and Dr. Patterson says you're doing better." Sophie turned her gaze to the doctor. "Can I go home?" "Maybe this afternoon if you keep improving. How do you feel?" "Tired, but my chest doesn't hurt as much." "That's good. That's really good." Dr. Patterson made some notes on her tablet. "I'll come check on you again in a few hours."
In the meantime, rest. Let the medicine do its work. After she left, Sophie looked up at Evan with eyes that were too knowing for a 7-year-old. You didn't sleep, did you? I slept a little. You're lying. You always get that crease between your eyebrows when you lie. Evan touched his forehead self-consciously. When did you get so smart? Mom used to say I got it from you, the smart part and the stubborn part. Yeah, well, your mom was biased. Sophie smiled, a real smile this time, and something in Evan's chest unclenched slightly. She was going to be okay. This crisis, at least, was passing. There would be others. He knew that, had accepted it as the price of loving someone whose heart didn't work the way it should. But today, this morning, his daughter was going to be okay. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Claire. How is she? Evan typed back. Better. Fever broke, might get to go home this afternoon. I'm glad, really glad. Then after a pause, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about your daughter being everything. I understand that now. I didn't before, but I do now. Evan wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just sent back a simple, thank you. When things settle, if you want to, I don't know, talk? I feel like I owe you an explanation for why I reacted the way I did last night. You don't owe me anything, Evan typed again, but even as he sent it, he knew he was curious. There was a story there, in Claire's scars and her fear and her certainty that everyone left. A story that felt familiar in ways he couldn't quite name. Maybe not, but I'd like to tell you anyway, if you're willing to listen. Before Evan could respond, Sophie tugged on his sleeve. Who are you texting? Just someone from last night, the woman from the river. Sophie's eyes widened. The one with the scars? Yeah. She wanted to make sure you were okay. That's nice of her. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then added, her scars looked like they hurt. I think they probably did. A long time ago. Do you think she's lonely, living in that big apartment all by herself? Out of the mouths of children. Evan looked at his daughter, at her two wise eyes and her gentle heart, and wondered how she'd managed to stay so soft when the world had been so hard to her. Maybe, he said honestly. I think maybe she is. You should invite her to visit, when I'm better. I could show her my rock collection. Evan smiled despite himself. Sophie's rock collection consisted of approximately 300 stones she'd picked up from various parking lots and playgrounds, each one cataloged and labeled with the kind of serious dedication most people reserved for valuable collectibles. I'm not sure she'd be interested in rocks, Soph. Everyone's interested in rocks if you explain them right. That's what Mr. Harrison says. Mr. Harrison was Sophie's second-grade teacher, apparently a geology enthusiast. And she looked sad. Maybe rocks would make her less sad. It was such a Sophie solution. Simple, kind, completely earnest. As if loneliness and grief and the weight of scars could be healed with rocks and the attention of a 7-year-old girl. But maybe that wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe healing did come from simple things, from someone caring enough to show you their collection, from being invited into small, ordinary moments that added up to something like connection. Evan looked at his phone. At Claire's message still waiting for a response. He thought about her standing in that penthouse, showing him her scars, asking if he would stay. He thought about running away when his daughter needed him, about the look on Claire's face when the elevator doors closed. And he thought about Sophie's question. Do you think she's lonely? Yeah. He thought maybe she was. He typed, when Sophie's better and things calm down, maybe we could get coffee. You can tell me your story, and I'll tell you mine. Fair trade. The response came quickly. I'd like that. Thank you, Evan. Thank you for checking on her. It means more than you know. Evan set his phone aside and turned his full attention back to Sophie, who was already drifting back to sleep, exhausted from her brief conversation. He watched her chest rise and fall, watched the numbers on the monitor slowly trend toward normal, and felt something shift in the constant weight he carried. Maybe Dr. Patterson was right. Maybe he couldn't keep doing this completely alone. Maybe there was something to be said for letting people in, even just a little, even just enough to share the occasional coffee and swap stories about scars and survival. The morning passed in slow increments. Nurses brought breakfast that Sophie picked at without enthusiasm. Dr. Patterson returned with better news,
Heart rate down to 115, fever completely gone, all signs pointing toward discharge by early afternoon. Evan filled out paperwork, accepted instructions for home care, nodded along to warnings about rest and reduced activity, and watching for any signs of relapse. By 2 o'clock, they were finally free to leave. Evan carried Sophie to the car even though she insisted she could walk, unwilling to let her expend any unnecessary energy. She fell asleep before they'd even left the hospital parking lot, her head lolled against the window, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been in 24 hours. When they got home, Evan carried her upstairs to their apartment, tucked her into bed, and finally let himself collapse onto the couch. His body ached from the river, from the long night in an uncomfortable hospital chair, from the constant tension of wondering if his daughter would be okay. His phone buzzed. Not a text this time, but a notification from the hospital's billing department. Evan opened it already knowing what he'd find. A preliminary estimate for Sophie's emergency visit, her overnight stay, the tests and medications and monitoring. $8,472 after insurance. Evan stared at the number, felt it settle into his gut like a stone. He had the money in savings, but that would wipe out 2/3 of what he'd managed to put away. And if Dr. Patterson was right about surgery being necessary in the next year or two, he closed the notification without responding to it. That was a problem for tomorrow, for next week, for whenever he could face it without wanting to put his fist through a wall. For now, Sophie was safe. She was home. She was sleeping peacefully in her bed with her stuffed elephant tucked under her arm and her rock collection arranged on her nightstand. For now, that was enough. Evan closed his eyes and let himself rest. The sleep didn't last long. Evan woke 2 hours later to the sound of Sophie coughing in her bedroom, a wet, rattling sound that sent him stumbling down the hallway before he was fully conscious. She was sitting up in bed, her face flushed again, her breathing labored. "Dad," she wheezed, "I can't. It's hard to breathe." Evan's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone, already pulling up Dr. Patterson's emergency number. But before he could dial, Sophie's breathing eased slightly, the panic in her eyes fading to simple exhaustion. "Better?" Evan asked, his heart still hammering against his ribs. Sophie nodded, coughed once more, then settled back against her pillows. "I think so. It just scared me." It had scared Evan too, had sent him right back to that hospital room, to the monitor's beeping warnings, to the possibility of losing the only person left in his world who made any of it matter. He sat on the edge of her bed, felt her forehead with the back of his hand, still warm but not burning the way it had been. "Dr. Patterson said you might have some residual symptoms for a few days. Your body's still recovering." "I know, I just wish I felt normal again." "You will. It just takes time." Sophie reached for her stuffed elephant, pulled it close. "Dad, are you scared all the time? About me, I mean. About my heart?" The question landed like a punch. Evan wanted to lie, to tell his daughter that he wasn't scared, that everything was fine, that she didn't need to worry about him worrying about her. But Sophie deserved better than comfortable lies. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I'm scared all the time. But not because I think you're fragile or broken. I'm scared because I love you so much that the thought of anything happening to you feels impossible to survive." Sophie considered this, her small face serious. "But you would survive. You survived when Mom died. I survived because I had you, because I had to be here for you. So we survive for each other." It was such a simple way of putting it, and so completely accurate that Evan felt something crack in his chest. "Yeah, kiddo, we survive for each other." Sophie smiled, tired but genuine. "I think that's pretty good, even if it's scary sometimes." Evan kissed her forehead, smoothed her hair back. "Get some more rest. I'll be right in the living room if you need me." But as he stood to leave, Sophie caught his hand. "Dad, I've been thinking about the lady from the river, the one with the scars." "What about her?" "I think she needs someone to survive for. I think that's why she looks so sad." Evan studied his daughter, this small person with the fragile heart and the enormous capacity for understanding things that most adults missed. "What makes you say that?" "Because when you left, she looked the same way you look sometimes when you think I'm asleep. Like she's trying really hard to be okay, but doesn't quite know how." The observation was so accurate it hurt. Evan thought about Claire's question,
Would you stay if you saw who I really am and understood it differently now? She hadn't been asking if he could handle her scars. She'd been asking if she was worth the effort of staying, if someone broken could still deserve that kind of commitment. Maybe you're right, Evan said softly. So you should invite her over. When I'm better, I really do want to show her my rock collection. Evan laughed despite himself. Okay, when you're better, we'll invite her over for rocks. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep, leaving Evan standing in the doorway of her room, wondering how his 7-year-old daughter had gotten so wise. He went back to the couch, picked up his phone, and stared at his last message exchange with Claire. The conversation had ended with his suggestion of coffee, her acceptance, and then nothing. 2 days had passed since then. 2 days of keeping Sophie home from school, of monitoring her breathing and her heart rate, of slowly watching her return to something like normal. 2 days of thinking about Claire Whitmore standing in her penthouse, showing him scars she clearly believed made her unlovable. Evan opened a new message, typed, "Sophie's doing better. Still recovering, but definitely on the mend. She asked me to invite you over when she's feeling up to visitors. Apparently she wants to show you her rock collection. Fair warning, it's extensive and she takes it very seriously." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then set the phone down and tried not to think about whether Claire would respond. The answer came 15 minutes later. "I would love to see her rock collection. I'm glad she's feeling better. And Evan, thank you for not forgetting about me." There was something raw in that last sentence, something that spoke to years of being forgotten, of people making promises they didn't keep, of being left behind so many times that gratitude for simple remembrance became reflexive. "I didn't forget," Evan typed back. "I've been thinking about what you said, about people leaving when things get hard. I think maybe we have more in common than you realize." "How so?" Evan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He'd spent 2 years not talking about his life, not sharing the weight of single parenthood and medical bills and constant fear. He'd learned to be self-sufficient, to handle everything alone, to never ask for help because asking meant admitting he couldn't do it all. But something about Claire's honesty demanded his own. "Because I know what it's like to wonder if you're too much," he typed slowly. "Too broken, too complicated, too hard to love. I know what it's like to watch people back away when they realize what staying actually requires. After Lauren died, I lost most of my friends. Not because they didn't care, but because being around me was too sad, too heavy, too real. People want to help in theory, but the actual practice of showing up day after day when someone's life is hard, most people can't do it." The response took longer this time. When it came, it was just 2 words. "I understand." Then a moment later, "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me if it's too personal." "Go ahead." "What was she like? Your wife?" Evan leaned back against the couch, closed his eyes, and let himself remember. She was the kind of person who made everything feel possible. She could turn grocery shopping into an adventure, could find beauty in the most ordinary moments. When she got diagnosed, everyone expected her to fall apart, but she didn't. She got fierce. She fought so hard, not because she was afraid to die, but because she wanted every single moment she could get with Sophie. With me. He paused, then continued. "The last thing she said to me was, 'Take care of our girl.' Not 'I love you,' not 'goodbye.' Just 'take care of our girl.' Because she knew that was the promise that mattered most." "You've kept it," Claire wrote back. "The way you are with Sophie, that's what keeping a promise looks like." "I'm trying. Some days I'm not sure I'm doing it right." "You jumped into a freezing river for a stranger while your daughter watched. You spent all night in a hospital chair. You put her needs above everything else without hesitation. Trust me, Evan, you're doing it right." The words settled something in Evan's chest that had been unsettled for a long time. He'd spent 2 years second-guessing every decision, wondering if he was enough, if Sophie needed more than he could give her. Hearing someone else say he was doing it right, even a near stranger with her own complicated relationship to being seen, meant more than it probably should. "Thank you," he typed. "That helps more than you know." "Then we're even. You saved my life. I gave you validation. Perfectly balanced." Evan smiled at the screen. There was humor there, dry and self-aware, and it felt like seeing another piece of who Claire Whitmore was beneath the scars and the fear.
Not even close to even, he wrote back, but I appreciate the thought. Over the next week, the text messages continued. Small exchanges at first, Claire checking on Sophie's recovery, Evan asking how Claire was doing, both of them dancing around the bigger conversation they'd agreed to have. But gradually, the messages got longer, more personal. Claire told him about her work. She was the CFO of Whitmore Industries, a manufacturing company her grandfather had founded and her father had built into a regional powerhouse. Evan told her about his job at the hospital, about the strange satisfaction of keeping a building running, of fixing problems that most people never noticed until they weren't fixed. They didn't talk about the river. They didn't talk about scars or late-night emergency rooms or the question Claire had asked that Evan still hadn't fully answered. Instead, they talked around these things, building something that felt like the foundation of actual friendship. Sophie recovered slowly but steadily. By the end of the week, she was back to her normal energy level, begging to return to school, complaining about being bored at home. Dr. Patterson cleared her for regular activities with the usual warnings about taking it easy, about paying attention to her body, about coming in immediately if anything felt wrong. She's resilient, the doctor said during the follow-up appointment. Kids usually are. But Evan, we still need to talk about long-term management. This was a warning. The next incident might be worse. I know. I'll make an appointment to discuss options. Good. And Evan? Take care of yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup. It was advice Evan had heard 100 times and followed approximately never. But as he drove Sophie home from the appointment, he thought about Claire's messages, about the way talking to someone who understood loneliness had made him feel slightly less alone. Maybe there was something to Dr. Patterson's advice after all. That evening, after Sophie was settled with her homework at the kitchen table, Evan sent Claire a message. Sophie's been cleared for visitors. She's very excited about rocks. How does Saturday afternoon work for you? The response came quickly. Saturday's perfect. Should I bring anything? Just yourself. Sophie will provide more than enough entertainment. Evan? I'm nervous. I don't really do this. Social situations, meeting new people, especially children. What if she... The message cut off, then started again. What if I say the wrong thing? Evan understood that fear too, the terror of being seen and found wanting. Sophie doesn't judge people. She just sees them. Trust me, she'll love you. And if it gets overwhelming, just tell me. We'll take a break. Okay, I can do this. You can. And Claire, thank you for trying. I know it's not easy. Saturday arrived with unseasonably warm weather, October giving them one last gift of sunshine before winter set in for real. Evan spent the morning cleaning the apartment, which mostly meant relocating Sophie's various collections, rocks, yes, but also feathers, interesting leaves, a jar of buttons she'd been sorting by color, into something resembling organization. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement, changing her outfit 3 times before settling on her favorite purple dress and the sneakers with the lights in the heels. Do I look okay? Should I wear my nice shoes? You look perfect, kiddo. And she's coming to meet you, not to judge your fashion choices. But what if she thinks I'm weird? Not everyone likes rocks. Evan knelt down to Sophie's level, put his hands on her shoulders. Anyone who thinks you're weird for liking rocks isn't worth impressing. Be yourself. That's always enough. Sophie nodded, but Evan could see the nervousness in her eyes. She wanted this to go well, wanted Claire to like her, and the weight of that wanting was almost heartbreaking in its earnestness. When the knock came at 2 o'clock, Sophie jumped up from the couch, where she'd been arranging her rock collection for optimal presentation. She's here! Dad! She's here! I noticed. Why don't you let me get the door? Evan opened it to find Claire standing in the hallway, looking nothing like the woman he'd pulled from the river 2 weeks ago. She was dressed simply. Jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. But there was tension in every line of her body, the posture of someone preparing for battle. Hi, she said, and her voice was tight with anxiety. I wasn't sure what to bring to meet a 7-year-old, so I brought cookies. Is that okay? Or is that weird? I can take them back. Cookies are perfect, Evan said gently, standing aside to let her in. Come in. Sophie's been counting down the minutes. Claire stepped into the apartment, and Evan watched her take it in. The small space, the worn furniture, the refrigerator covered in Sophie's artwork and school papers. It was so completely different from her penthouse that Evan felt a flash of self-consciousness. But Claire's expression showed only curiosity, no judgment. Sophie appeared in the doorway to the living room, suddenly shy. "Hi, I'm Sophie." "Hi, Sophie. I'm Claire." Claire set the box of cookies on the small entryway table and seemed unsure what to do with her hands. "Your dad told me you have a rock collection?" Sophie's face lit up. "Yes. Do you want to see it? I have 273 rocks, and each one has a story." "I would love to see it." The transformation was immediate. Sophie grabbed Claire's hand without hesitation, pulling her toward the living room where the rocks were carefully arranged on a folding table. Claire went willingly, and Evan followed, watching this interaction with something like wonder. "Okay, so this one," Sophie held up a smooth gray stone, "is from the parking lot at my school. I found it the day after Mom died, and it was shaped like a heart, so I knew it was from her, telling me she was okay." Claire took the stone carefully, turning it over in her palm. "It is shaped like a heart. That's beautiful." "And this one is from the river path, the same place where Dad saved you. I picked it up while we were waiting for the ambulance. Well, while we were waiting before you said you didn't want the ambulance." Claire's eyes flicked to Evan, something complicated passing over her face. "You kept a rock from that night?" "I keep rocks from all the important things. That's the whole point of a collection. Each one means something." For the next hour, Sophie walked Claire through her entire collection, telling stories about each rock, explaining her organization system, sharing memories that ranged from mundane to profound. And Claire listened with genuine attention, asking questions, holding each stone like it mattered, giving Sophie the kind of focused interest that most adults couldn't sustain for 5 minutes, much less 60. Evan stayed in the background watching and felt something shift in his understanding of Claire Whitmore. She'd been terrified to come here, terrified of saying the wrong thing or being too much or not enough. But with Sophie, all that fear had translated into careful attention, into showing up fully for a child she barely knew. That was what staying looked like too, Evan realized. Not just enduring through the hard moments, but showing up for the ordinary ones, giving someone your genuine presence even when you were scared. Eventually, Sophie's energy began to flag. She was still recovering, still not back to full strength. She settled onto the couch with her stuffed elephant, and Claire sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but available if Sophie wanted to close it. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie's voice was quiet, tentative. "About your scars?" Evan tensed, ready to intervene, but Claire just nodded. "You can ask me anything." "Do they still hurt?" "Sometimes. Not physically anymore, but yeah, sometimes they still hurt in other ways." Sophie considered this, running her fingers over the scar on her own chest. "Mine too. The doctors say it shouldn't hurt because it's all healed, but sometimes it does anyway, like it remembers." "Exactly like that. Like it remembers." "Do people stare at yours?" "Yes, all the time." "Mine too, especially in the summer when I wear tank tops. Some kids ask about it, but some just stare and whisper." Claire reached out slowly, giving Sophie time to pull away if she wanted, and gently touched the scar visible above Sophie's collar. "You know what I think? I think scars are proof that we survived something that tried to break us. They're like medals, evidence that we're stronger than the thing that hurt us." Sophie's eyes were shining with tears. "My mom used to say something like that. She said my scar was beautiful because it meant I was still here." "Your mom was right." Sophie leaned into Claire's side, and Claire's arm came around her shoulders automatically, the gesture protective and gentle. Evan felt his throat close up, watching his daughter find comfort with someone who understood her particular brand of being marked by survival. They stayed like that for a while, the three of them, in the small living room with afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Then Sophie yawned, fighting sleep, and Evan stood up. "Okay, kiddo, I think it's time for a rest." "But Claire just got here," Sophie protested, even as her eyes drooped. "I'll still be here when you wake up," Claire said, "if that's okay with your dad." Evan nodded. "More than okay." He carried Sophie to her bedroom, tucked her in, and returned to find Claire standing by the window, looking out at the street below. She turned when he entered, and he saw tear tracks on her face. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I don't know, I think so."
Claire wiped at her eyes. She's amazing, Evan. You're raising an amazing kid. Thank you. And thank you for being so good with her. I know you were nervous. I was terrified. I kept thinking I'd say the wrong thing, that I'd scare her or make her uncomfortable. But she saw me. Really saw me. The scars, the awkwardness, all of it, and she didn't care. Sophie has a gift for that, for seeing people as they actually are. Claire turned back to the window. When she asked about my scars, I thought I'd panic. I thought I'd shut down the way I always do when people ask. But she made it feel safe somehow, like we were just comparing notes on being marked by things we survived. Evan moved to stand beside her at the window. She has a scar too, from heart surgery when she was 5. She's self-conscious about it sometimes, but she's also weirdly matter-of-fact, like it's just part of who she is. That's a healthy way to be. It's how Lauren taught her to think about it. Before she died, she made sure Sophie understood that scars don't mean broken. They mean survived. Claire was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier. I've spent so long thinking my scars made me unlovable, that anyone who saw them would leave. Has everyone left? Everyone who mattered. My father died when I was 15, heart attack. My mother couldn't handle having a daughter who reminded her of the fire every time she looked at me. She's still alive, but we don't talk. Haven't in years. Romantic relationships. She laughed bitterly. Let's just say they don't last long once the scars come out. I'm sorry, I can't imagine how lonely that must be. You can, actually. You've been there too. Different circumstances, but the same essential loneliness of handling everything by yourself because there's no one else who stayed. She was right. Evan had been living in that loneliness for 2 years, had gotten so used to it that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to share the weight with someone else. Can I show you something? Claire asked suddenly. I've been working up the courage to tell you this since I got here. Of course. Claire pulled out her phone, swiped through photos, then handed it to Evan. The screen showed a news article from 15 years ago. 8-year-old hero saves father in house fire. The photo showed a young girl with severe burns being loaded into an ambulance, and an older man, also burned, but less severely, holding her hand. That's you, Evan said quietly. That's me. What they didn't put in the article is that the fire was my fault. I was playing with matches in my bedroom. I started the fire that nearly killed us both. Evan looked up at her. You were 8 years old. Old enough to know better. Old enough that I've spent the last 24 years carrying the guilt of what I did. My father never blamed me, but I blamed myself. And after he died, I let the guilt become part of my identity. The girl who was broken because she deserved to be broken. Claire. That night at the river, I didn't slip, I let myself fall. The confession landed between them like a physical thing. Evan's mind raced backward, replaying the scene, Claire near the embankment, her scream that had sounded more surprised than terrified, the way she'd gone into the water without much struggle. You tried to... I don't know what I tried to do, Claire interrupted. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I still don't know. Maybe I wanted to die. Maybe I just wanted to stop feeling so alone for a minute. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone would notice I was gone. I noticed. You did. You jumped in without thinking, and then you asked me if I needed help, and no one had asked me that in so long that I didn't know how to answer. Evan reached for her hand, held it carefully. I'm asking again. Do you need help? Claire's fingers tightened around his. I think I might. I think I've needed help for a really long time, but I didn't know how to ask. Didn't think anyone would care enough to say yes. I'm saying yes. Why? You barely know me. You have enough to deal with between Sophie and work and everything else. Why would you take on someone else's problems? Evan thought about Sophie's observation, that Claire needed someone to survive for. He thought about his own loneliness, about the way sharing these past 2 weeks with someone who understood had made the weight feel slightly more bearable. Because maybe we can help each other, he said simply. Maybe we're both tired of doing everything alone. Maybe there's something to be said for sharing the weight. Claire's eyes filled with tears again. I don't know if I know how to do that. Let someone help. Be someone's... What, friend?
I haven't had a real friend in years. Then we'll figure it out together. No expectations, no pressure. Just we show up for each other when we can, as much as we can. What if I'm too broken? What if I... Claire. Evan waited until she looked at him. Everyone's broken in some way. The question isn't whether you're broken. It's whether you're willing to let someone see the broken parts and stay anyway. She studied his face, searching for something. Doubt, maybe, or insincerity. Whatever she was looking for, she must not have found it, because she nodded slowly. Okay, I can try that. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, standing by the window in Evan's small apartment while Sophie slept down the hall. Then Claire's phone buzzed, and she pulled it out with a grimace. Work, she said, scanning the screen. There's a problem with the quarterly reports. I need to go handle this. Of course, do what you need to do. Claire hesitated, then said, Can I come back? Not just sometime vaguely in the future, but actually come back? Maybe next weekend. You're welcome anytime. Sophie would love it, and honestly, so would I. Something in Claire's expression softened, the perpetual tension easing just slightly. Okay, next Saturday then. I'll bring better cookies. The cookies were fine. They were store-bought. I can do better. After she left, Evan stood in the quiet apartment and felt the space differently. It was still small, still worn around the edges, but it felt less like a fortress he'd built to keep the world out, and more like a place where people might actually want to be. Sophie woke an hour later, disoriented and asking for Claire. When Evan explained she'd had to leave for work, Sophie's face fell. But she's coming back, right? She said she would. Next Saturday. She promised. Sophie nodded, satisfied, then said, I like her, Dad. She understands about scars. I like her too, kiddo. Are you going to be friends? Real friends? Not just people who are nice to each other sometimes? Evan considered the question. What he and Claire were building felt more significant than casual friendship, but less defined than anything he had words for. They were two broken people learning to be less alone together, and maybe that was its own kind of relationship. I think we might be, he said finally, if we both figure out how. The week that followed settled into a new rhythm. Claire texted daily, sometimes about work stress, sometimes just sharing random thoughts. Evan responded when he could, between his shifts at the hospital and Sophie's constant needs, and found himself looking forward to these small exchanges more than he wanted to admit. On Wednesday, Claire sent a photo of her office with the caption, Is it normal to want to throw your computer out the window? Evan wrote back, Depends. What did the computer do? Existed. Also, my COO is being impossible about the new manufacturing contracts. Want to talk about it? Not really. Want to hear about it anyway? Sure. What followed was a detailed breakdown of corporate politics that Evan understood maybe 30% of, but he listened anyway, asked questions, and watched as Claire's texts went from frustrated to thoughtful to almost calm. She didn't need him to solve her problems. She just needed someone to witness them, to acknowledge that what she was dealing with was hard. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Evan's phone rang, Claire's name on the screen. Hey, he answered. Everything okay? Can I ask you something personal? Her voice was tight, controlled. And you can tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead. That hospital bill from Sophie's emergency visit, have you paid it yet? Evan felt his stomach drop. Why are you asking? Because I accessed some records I probably shouldn't have accessed, and I saw the amount. $8,000, Evan. That's not nothing. It's handled. I have savings. Had savings. Past tense. And Dr. Patterson's notes mention possible future surgery that could cost significantly more. Evan's jaw tightened. You had no right to look at those records. I know, I'm sorry, but Evan, I can help. I have resources. Money doesn't mean much to me, but it clearly means everything to you right now, and I could... No. The word came out harder than he intended. Absolutely not. Why not? You saved my life. Let me help you. Because that's not how this works. I didn't save you so you'd owe me something. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. And I'm not taking your money because Sophie is my responsibility, my daughter, my problem to solve. She's not a problem, Evan. She's a little girl who needs medical care,
and you shouldn't have to bankrupt yourself to provide it. I'm not bankrupting myself, I'm managing. That's what I do. Claire was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "This is pride talking. Stupid, stubborn pride that's going to hurt Sophie in the long run. Don't you dare tell me what's good for my daughter. I'm not. I'm telling you that accepting help isn't weakness. It's not failure. It's letting someone care about you enough to share the burden." Evan paced his small living room, anger and fear, and something else he couldn't name warring in his chest. "You don't understand.
I've been doing this alone for 2 years. I figured out how to make it work. I don't need... Everyone needs help sometimes, Evan. Even you. Especially you. Why do you even care? We barely know each other. Because you jumped into a freezing river for a stranger. Because you didn't hesitate when someone needed you. Because your daughter looks at you like you hung the moon. And I think anyone who inspires that kind of love deserves to not drown under medical debt." The fight went out of Evan all at once, leaving him hollow. He sank onto the couch, phone pressed to his ear, and felt the weight of 2 years crash down on him. "I can't take your money," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Okay, I hear you. But Evan, the offer stands. If you change your mind, if things get worse, if you need help, I'm here. No strings, no obligations, just help." After they hung up, Evan sat in the dark and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. The terror of Sophie's emergency. The crushing weight of that hospital bill. The knowledge that Dr. Patterson was right about future surgery, and that he had no idea how he'd pay for it when the time came. He'd been so focused on staying strong, on handling everything himself, that he'd forgotten how exhausting it was to carry it all alone. The next morning, he woke to find an envelope slipped under his apartment door. Inside was a check for $8,472 and a note in Claire's handwriting. "Not a gift, a loan. Pay me back whenever you can, or don't. Your choice. But please don't let pride keep Sophie from getting the care she needs. Please, Evan, let me help." Evan stared at the check for a long time. Every instinct he had screamed to tear it up, to prove he could handle this himself. But then he thought about Sophie, about her fragile heart, and the surgery she'd probably need, about how depleting his savings now meant having nothing when that inevitable crisis came. He thought about Claire's words. Accepting help isn't weakness. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just admitting that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. He deposited the check that afternoon, then sent Claire a text. "Thank you. I'll pay you back." Her response came immediately. "I know you will. That's not why I did it." "Why did you do it?" "Because you stayed. Even after you had to leave that night, you came back. You kept texting. You invited me into your life. You let me meet Sophie. Nobody does that for me, Evan. Nobody stays. So I wanted to show you that I can stay too." Evan read the message 3 times, feeling something shift in his chest. This was what Claire had been asking that night in her penthouse. What she'd been trying to understand. What staying actually looked like in practice, not in theory. It looked like this, like showing up when it would be easier to disappear, like offering help when you didn't have to, like choosing someone's burden as if it were your own. Saturday arrived with November cold settling over Ravenport, the kind of bitter wind that promised snow before Thanksgiving. Claire showed up at 2 o'clock exactly, carrying a white bakery box that turned out to contain homemade chocolate chip cookies that made Sophie's eyes go wide. "You made these? Yourself?" Sophie inspected a cookie with serious attention. "I did. Fair warning, I haven't baked in about 15 years, so they might be terrible." Sophie took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then announced, "They're perfect. Can you teach me how to make them?" Claire's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way Evan hadn't seen before. "I would love to teach you. Though you should know I only know how to make 3 things: cookies, scrambled eggs, and toast. My culinary skills are extremely limited." "That's 3 more things than I know how to make," Sophie said seriously. "Dad usually cooks. I'm in charge of setting the table." They spent the afternoon in the kitchen, Claire walking Sophie through the cookie recipe with surprising patience. Flour ended up everywhere, on the counters, on Sophie's face, somehow in Claire's hair, and the second batch burned because they were too busy laughing to watch the timer, but the joy in that small kitchen was so tangible Evan could almost touch it. He stayed out of the way mostly, watching from the doorway as his daughter and this woman who'd tried to let herself drown bonded over butter and sugar. At one point, Sophie asked Claire about her job, and Claire explained corporate finance in terms a 7-year-old could understand, turning profit margins into a story about making sure everyone got paid fairly for their work. "So you make sure people get what they deserve?" Sophie asked, licking chocolate off her fingers. "I try to. Sometimes it's complicated, but that's the goal." "That's a good job, making sure things are fair." Claire looked at Evan over Sophie's head, and something passed between them, an understanding maybe of how Sophie had a way of distilling complex things down to their essential truth. As the afternoon faded into evening, Sophie's energy began to flag. She'd pushed herself hard, excited by having Claire there, but her body was still recovering from the crisis 2 weeks ago. Claire noticed before Evan had to say anything, gently suggesting they clean up the kitchen and let Sophie rest. They settled Sophie on the couch with a movie, and she was asleep within 15 minutes, her head pillowed on Claire's lap. Claire stroked her hair absently, her expression distant. "What are you thinking about?" Evan asked quietly. "How easy she makes it look. Being vulnerable, trusting people." Claire's fingers traced through Sophie's dark hair. "She barely knows me, but she fell asleep on me like it was the most natural thing in the world. She trusts her instincts about people, and her instincts say you're safe." "Am I? Safe, I mean. I'm still figuring out how to be a person who doesn't run when things get hard." "You're here, aren't you? That's what matters." Claire was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" "Of course." "The night of the fire, when I was 8, I remember my father carrying me out of the house. I remember the pain, remember screaming. But what I remember most clearly is him saying, 'It's okay, baby girl, it's okay,' over and over, even though it wasn't okay, even though we were both burning. He stayed calm for me, made me feel safe, even when we weren't. He sounds like he was a good father. He was the best, and when he died, I felt like I'd lost the only person who'd ever loved me despite seeing all my broken parts." Claire's voice cracked. "My mother couldn't do it. She looked at me and saw the fire, saw the scars, saw all the medical bills and the surgeries and the therapy. She saw everything I'd cost her, so she left. Not physically, but emotionally. She was gone." Evan moved to sit beside her on the couch, careful not to disturb Sophie. "That wasn't your fault. You were a child who needed her mother. I know that logically, but knowing it and believing it are different things. For years, I thought if I could just be perfect enough in every other way, if I was smart enough, successful enough, rich enough, then maybe the scars wouldn't matter. Maybe someone would stay." "Did anyone?" "No, every relationship ended the same way. Things would be fine when I kept my clothes on, when I could hide the scars. But the moment they saw, the moment I let myself be fully seen, they'd start pulling away, making excuses, finding reasons to be busy, and eventually they'd leave. So you stop trying. I stopped trying. I built this perfect corporate life, this reputation for being brilliant and cold and untouchable. If no one got close enough to see the scars, no one could leave because of them." Evan reached for her hand, the one that wasn't stroking Sophie's hair. "That night at the river, when you asked me if I would stay, you weren't really asking about me, were you?" Claire shook her head. "I was asking if anyone could, if staying was even possible for someone like me. And now? Now I think maybe it is, because you're still here. Sophie's still here. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." They sat together in the gathering darkness, Sophie sleeping between them, and Evan felt the strangeness of this moment, how 3 weeks ago he'd been a single father walking by a river, and now he was here, holding hands with a woman who'd almost drowned, building something that felt like it might be family. Sophie stirred, mumbled something incomprehensible, and settled deeper into sleep. Claire smiled down at her, and Evan saw real affection there, genuine care for his daughter that had nothing to do with obligation or debt. "She's special," Claire said softly. "You've raised someone really special." "I had help. Lauren did most of the hard work before—" He stopped, the familiar grief catching in his throat. "Do you miss her? Still, I mean, after 2 years?" "Every day. But it's different now. Less sharp. More like a permanent ache instead of an acute pain. I can think about her without falling apart.
I can remember the good parts without being destroyed by the fact that she's gone. Do you think you'll ever... Claire hesitated. I don't mean to pry, but do you think you'll ever want that again? Partnership, love, someone to share your life with. Evan considered the question honestly. I don't know. I've been so focused on just surviving, on being enough for Sophie, that I haven't let myself think about what I might want for myself. But lately, he looked at Claire, at the way she held his daughter so carefully. Lately, I've been thinking maybe I've been alone long enough. Claire met his eyes, and Evan saw hope there, fragile and tentative. Yeah? Yeah. Before either of them could say anything else, Evan's phone rang. He pulled it out, saw Dr. Patterson's name, and his heart immediately sank. She never called on weekends unless something was wrong. Dr. Patterson, is everything... Evan, I'm sorry to call, but I just got Sophie's latest blood work back from her appointment last week. Her markers are concerning. We need to move up the timeline on that surgery we discussed. The world tilted. Evan stood up, moving into the kitchen so his voice wouldn't wake Sophie. How concerning. Her heart function is declining faster than I'd hoped. If we don't intervene soon, we're looking at potential heart failure within 6 to 12 months. And the surgery, how soon are we talking? Ideally, within the next 3 months. I know that's fast, and I know it's expensive, I know. Evan pressed his palm against his forehead, trying to think through the panic. How much? The procedure Sophie needs runs between $200,000 and $300,000. With your insurance, you'd be looking at $40,000 to $60,000 out of pocket. $40,000 to $60,000. Evan had $12,000 in savings, less now after the emergency room visit. Even with the hospital bill paid thanks to Claire's loan, he was nowhere close to being able to afford this. Okay, he said, because what else was there to say? Okay, schedule it. Whatever she needs, schedule it. Evan, I know this is overwhelming. I'm going to have our financial counselor reach out to you about payment plans and assistance programs. We'll figure this out. After he hung up, Evan stood in the kitchen and tried to remember how to breathe. $40,000 to $60,000. He could pick up extra shifts, could work overtime, could sell everything he owned, and still not make that number. Sophie was going to need surgery, and he had no idea how to pay for it. He felt Claire before he heard her, her presence in the kitchen doorway. Evan? What's wrong? He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, he'd fall apart, and he couldn't afford to fall apart right now. Sophie needs surgery, soon, within 3 months. Okay, what kind of surgery? Heart. Her ventricle. It's failing faster than they thought. His voice cracked. $40,000 to $60,000 after insurance. I don't have $40,000 to $60,000, Claire. I don't even have half of that. Claire crossed the kitchen, put her hands on his shoulders, forced him to look at her. Then we'll figure it out. Payment plans, fundraising, medical loans. There are options. I've looked at the options. The payment plans still require a significant deposit. The fundraising might get me a few thousand, but not enough. And the medical loans, the interest rates are predatory. I'd be paying them off for the rest of my life. So, let me help. Let me pay for it. Evan jerked back like she'd struck him. No, absolutely not. The hospital bill was one thing, but this is too much, Claire. I can't let you do this. Why not? I have the money. It means nothing to me compared to what it means to you, compared to Sophie's life. Because it changes things. Because then I owe you something I can never repay. And that's not... I can't build a friendship on that kind of debt. Claire's hands tightened on his shoulders. You don't owe me anything. You never did. This isn't about debt, Evan. This is about me wanting to help someone I care about, someone who matters to me. Is that really so hard to accept? Yes, because I've spent 2 years learning to do this alone, learning to be enough by myself, and accepting this kind of help feels like admitting I've failed. You haven't failed. You've survived impossible circumstances, but surviving alone and thriving with support are two different things. Claire's voice softened. Please, please let me do this. Not because you owe me, but because I want to. Because Sophie deserves this. Because you deserve to not carry this burden alone. Evan wanted to say no. Every instinct he had demanded he refuse, that he find another way, that he protect his independence and his pride. But he thought about Sophie sleeping on the couch,
about her fragile heart failing while he scrambled for money he didn't have. He thought about what Lauren would say if she were here, that Sophie's life mattered more than his pride. "I'll pay you back," he said finally, the words tasting like defeat. "However long it takes, I'll pay every penny back." "I don't care about the money, Evan. I care about you, about Sophie, about—" She stopped, seemed to struggle with something. "I've spent my whole life alone because I was too afraid to let anyone see my broken parts. You've spent 2 years alone because you had no choice. But we have a choice now. We can keep doing this alone, or we can try doing it together." "Together," Evan repeated, testing the word. It felt foreign in his mouth, dangerous and hopeful in equal measure. "Together," Claire confirmed. "You help me learn how to let people in. I help you learn that accepting support doesn't make you weak. We figure out this whole staying thing together." Evan pulled her into a hug, felt her arms come around him, and let himself lean on someone else for the first time in 2 years. She held him while he shook, while the weight of everything finally caught up with him, while he let himself be something other than strong. "Thank you," he whispered against her shoulder. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for letting me." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other up in Evan's small kitchen while Sophie slept in the next room, and the future stretched out ahead of them, uncertain but no longer quite so lonely. When they finally pulled apart, Claire's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "So, surgery in 3 months. What do we need to do to get ready?" "We, not you. We." Evan took a shaky breath and started making a list. They'd need to schedule the procedure, coordinate with Dr. Patterson, arrange for time off work, plan for Sophie's recovery. The details were overwhelming, but with Claire beside him, asking questions and taking notes on her phone, they felt manageable. Hours later, after Sophie woke and they'd shared dinner, takeout pizza that Claire insisted on paying for, Claire prepared to leave. Sophie hugged her goodbye with the unselfconscious affection of a child who'd decided someone was safe, and Claire held on maybe a little longer than necessary. At the door, Claire turned back to Evan. "I meant what I said earlier about doing this together. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to hold you to that." "Good, because I need someone to hold me accountable, to make sure I don't run when things get scary. And I need someone to remind me that accepting help isn't failure." Claire smiled, real and warm. "Deal." After she left, Evan cleaned up the dinner dishes and helped Sophie get ready for bed. As he tucked her in, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Dad, Claire told me about my surgery while you were on the phone earlier." Evan's heart clenched. "She did? What did she say?" "She said my heart needs some help and the doctors are going to fix it, and that she'll be here with us the whole time. Is that true? Will she really stay?" Evan thought about everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks, about Claire jumping or not jumping into the river, about her showing him her scars and asking if he would stay, about her offering help even when he was too proud to accept it, about the way she'd held Sophie this afternoon, stroking her hair like she was something precious. "Yeah, kiddo, I think she will. I think she'll really stay." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, and Evan sat beside her bed watching her breathe, listening to the steady rhythm of her fragile heart. 3 months until surgery. 12 weeks to get everything ready, to prepare Sophie emotionally, to arrange logistics and finances and all the impossible details that stood between now and his daughter's survival. But he wouldn't be doing it alone this time. Claire would be there. And maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. The 3 months before Sophie's surgery passed in a blur of appointments and preparations, and Claire becoming so woven into their lives that Evan couldn't remember what days had felt like without her. She showed up for the small things, Tuesday dinners that became tradition, weekend mornings where she'd appear with pastries and coffee, the ordinary moments that built something bigger than either of them had planned. But it was the Monday morning in early December when everything shifted in a way none of them expected. Evan's phone rang at 6:30, jolting him from restless sleep. Claire's name on the screen, but her voice when he answered was wrong, tight and controlled in a way that meant she was holding herself together by force of will alone. "I need you to not panic," she said, which immediately made Evan panic. "But there's a situation at work. Someone leaked information about my scars to the press. There's going to be a story. Evan sat up, his mind racing.
What kind of story? The ugly kind. My COO, Marcus Webb, he's been trying to push me out for months. Apparently he hired a private investigator who dug up the fire, the hospitalizations, everything. He's spinning it as me being unstable, unreliable, damaged goods. The contempt in those last two words made Evan's chest tight. That's illegal. That has to be illegal. It's borderline. And by the time legal action goes through, the damage will be done. The board is calling an emergency meeting this afternoon. Marcus is going to recommend my termination, and he probably has the votes. Claire, I know what you're going to say, that I should fight, that I shouldn't let him win. But Evan, I'm so tired. I've spent my whole life fighting to prove my scars don't make me less, and I don't know if I have another fight in me. Evan was already out of bed, already reaching for clothes. Where are you? At the office. I've been here since 4. I couldn't sleep. I'm coming. You don't have to. Yes, I do. You showed up for me, for Sophie. Now I'm showing up for you. That's how this works. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Evan thought she might have hung up. Then quietly, Okay, come. Evan called his supervisor, explained he had a family emergency, which wasn't technically true but felt true enough, and arranged coverage for his shift. He woke Sophie, got her ready for school earlier than usual, and dropped her off at his neighbor's apartment with promises of extra screen time if she didn't complain. Then he drove to the gleaming glass tower downtown that housed Whitmore Industries, a building he'd passed 1,000 times without thinking about who worked inside. Claire was in her office on the 21st floor, standing by the windows that overlooked the river. She didn't turn when Evan entered, just kept staring out at the water that had almost taken her life 2 months ago. You came, she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she still couldn't quite believe that people did that. Of course I came. Evan crossed to stand beside her. Talk to me. What's the actual situation? Claire pulled up an email on her phone, handed it to him. The message from Marcus Webb was coldly professional, outlining concerns about Claire's emotional stability, her ability to handle the pressures of leadership, the potential liability of having a CFO with undisclosed trauma history. It was couched in corporate language, but the message was clear. She was broken, therefore expendable. He's using the fire against you, Evan said, rage building in his chest. A trauma you experienced as a child, something that wasn't your fault, but it was my fault. I told you that. I started the fire. You were 8 years old, Claire. 8. You didn't understand what you were doing. It doesn't matter. What matters is Marcus found the weak spot and he's exploiting it. And the worst part is, he's not wrong. I am unstable. I did try to let myself drown. I do have scars that I've hidden for my entire professional career. Every accusation he's making has some kernel of truth. Evan grabbed her shoulders, forced her to look at him. Listen to me. Having trauma doesn't make you unstable. Having scars doesn't make you unreliable. And hiding parts of yourself that other people have taught you to be ashamed of doesn't make you dishonest. It makes you human. The board won't see it that way. Then make them see it that way. You're the CFO of this company. You've built this business, managed millions of dollars, made decisions that kept hundreds of people employed. Don't let one vindictive man take that away from you. Claire pulled away from him, wrapped her arms around herself. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You jumped into a freezing river and survived. You showed me your scars when you thought I'd leave. You're learning to bake cookies with a 7-year-old. You're the strongest person I know, Claire. You just don't see it yet. And if they fire me anyway, if I fight and lose, then at least you fought. At least you didn't let them make you disappear without forcing them to see you first. Claire was quiet for a long moment, then straightened her shoulders in a way that reminded Evan of Sophie preparing for something scary. The meeting's at 2. I need to prepare a response, a defense. Then let's prepare one. What do you need? They spent the next 4 hours building Claire's case. Evan knew nothing about corporate finance, but he knew how to listen, how to ask the questions that made Claire clarify her thinking. They went through her performance reviews, all exemplary, her financial reports consistently accurate, the major decisions she'd made over her 5 years as CFO, nearly all successful. Marcus Webb's argument relied on Claire being too damaged to function. The evidence showed someone who'd functioned at the highest level despite carrying weight that would have crushed most people. At 1:30, Claire changed into a fresh suit, fixed her makeup, and transformed into the version of herself she showed the world: polished, professional, untouchable. But Evan could see the fear beneath the armor, the way her hands shook slightly as she gathered her materials. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I can come with you. Sit in the back of the room. Just be there." Claire shook her head. "This is something I need to do myself, but thank you for being here this morning, for helping me remember who I am. You're Claire Whitmore. You're brilliant and fierce, and you deserve better than this." She kissed his cheek, quick and soft. "I'll call you after. Either way." Evan waited in her office while she went to face the board, pacing the length of the windows, watching the river flow past below. He thought about that night 2 months ago, about diving into dark water without thinking, about pulling Claire to safety. This was a different kind of rescue. This time, Claire had to save herself. The call came at 4:15. Evan grabbed his phone on the first ring. "It's done," Claire said, and her voice was strange, not happy, not sad, just exhausted. "Can you meet me?" "Where?" "The river path. Where you pulled me out." Evan's stomach dropped. "Claire, I'm okay, I promise. I need to be there. With you." He found her 20 minutes later, standing at the exact spot where she'd gone into the water. The November cold had turned the air brittle, the first threat of winter settling over Ravenport. Claire was still in her business suit, no coat, shivering. Evan shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "What happened?" "I told them everything, the fire, the scars, what Marcus was trying to do. I told them about this night at the river, about jumping in, or not jumping, I'm still not sure which. I told them about the shame I've carried my whole life, about hiding who I really am because I thought being broken made me worthless." She laughed, but it was a raw sound. "I basically had a complete emotional breakdown in front of the board of directors. And Marcus tried to use it against me, pointed out that I'd just proven his point about emotional instability, said someone who'd attempted—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter what he said. What matters is that I looked at him and I realized something." "What?" "That I didn't care anymore. About his opinion, about hiding, about pretending to be perfect. I'd spent so much energy keeping people from seeing my scars that I'd forgotten they were just part of my story, not the whole thing." Claire turned to face him. "So, I took off my jacket, right there in the boardroom, rolled up my sleeves and showed them the scars. All of them." Evan's breath caught. "Claire, I told them this was what survival looked like, that every scar on my body was evidence that I'd faced something that tried to destroy me and I'd won. And if they wanted to fire me for being a survivor, for having the audacity to keep living after trauma, then they weren't the kind of company I wanted to work for anyway." "What did they say?" "The chairman asked Marcus to leave the room. Then he asked me if I'd be willing to stay on as CFO under the condition that I start seeing a therapist. Which, fair enough, I probably should have done years ago, and I said yes." Relief crashed through Evan so intense it was almost painful. "So you kept your job?" "I kept my job. Marcus is being investigated for the illegal information gathering, and I'm apparently the new face of corporate transparency or something. The chairman wants me to do a press conference about mental health in the workplace." She laughed again, but this time it sounded almost genuine. "I went from hiding my scars for 30 years to planning to talk about them publicly. I don't know whether to be proud or terrified." "Be both. Both is fine." Claire leaned into him, and Evan wrapped his arms around her, holding her steady while she shook with reaction to everything that had happened. They stood there by the river while the sun started to set, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this morning, for reminding me I was worth fighting for." "You did the fighting. I just showed up." "Showing up is everything, Evan. It's the whole thing." They stayed there until the cold drove them back to their cars, and then Evan followed Claire home to make sure she was okay, that the adrenaline crash wasn't going to hit her alone. She fell asleep on her couch fully dressed, and Evan covered her with a blanket and sat in a chair across from her, just keeping watch,
His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Is Claire okay? I've been worried." Evan smiled and typed back, "She's okay. She was really brave today." "Good. Tell her I'm proud of her, and that we're having spaghetti for dinner tomorrow, and she has to come." The weeks that followed brought changes none of them expected. Claire's story went public, not the way Marcus had intended, but on Claire's terms. She did the press conference, talked about childhood trauma and adult shame and learning that scars didn't define you. The response was overwhelming. Messages from people who'd been hiding their own damage, their own broken places flooded in. Claire became a reluctant spokesperson for vulnerability in corporate culture, and while the attention made her uncomfortable, Evan could see her standing taller, moving through the world with less fear. Sophie's surgery was scheduled for January 15th. As the date approached, Evan felt the familiar terror building, the same panic that had gripped him during her last hospitalization. But this time, Claire was there for every appointment, every preparation meeting, every moment when the fear threatened to overwhelm him. The night before the surgery, Claire came to the apartment with dinner and a gift for Sophie. A smooth river stone she'd had polished and engraved with the words "Brave Heart." Sophie held it like treasure, running her fingers over the letters. "For my collection?" "For your collection, so you'll have something to hold tomorrow when you're scared." "I'm not scared," Sophie lied, and both adults let her have the fiction. After Sophie was asleep, Claire and Evan sat on the couch in the dark, not talking, just being together in the weighted silence before crisis. "I'm terrified," Evan finally said. "I know she's going to be fine. Dr. Patterson is the best. The procedure has a 95% success rate, but that 5%, I know." "I'm terrified too." "You don't have to be. She's not your daughter." Claire took his hand. "No, but she's yours, and you matter to me, which means she matters to me. That's how this works." The surgery lasted 6 hours. Evan paced the waiting room the entire time, drinking terrible coffee and reading the same magazine page without comprehending a word. Claire sat beside him, her presence steady, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand when the panic got too loud. When Dr. Patterson finally emerged, still in her scrubs, Evan couldn't breathe. "She did beautifully," the doctor said, and Evan's knees nearly gave out. "The repair was successful. Her heart function should improve significantly as she heals. She's going to be okay, Evan." He sat down hard in the nearest chair and put his head in his hands. Claire's arms came around him, holding him while he shook with relief so intense it felt like breaking. They let him see Sophie an hour later once she was stable in recovery. She was small and pale in the hospital bed, hooked up to more monitors than Evan could count, but her eyes were open and clear. "Hey kiddo, how are you feeling?" "Sleepy and my chest hurts, but Dr. Patterson says my heart is fixed now." "It is. You're going to be so much stronger now." Sophie's gaze drifted to where Claire stood in the doorway, hanging back to give them space. "Claire, did you stay the whole time?" "I did. Your dad needed someone to keep him from wearing a hole in the floor with his pacing." "You should come here. I want to show you something." Claire crossed to the bed, and Sophie pulled the engraved stone from under her pillow. "I held it the whole time before they put me to sleep. It helped." "I'm glad." Claire's voice was thick with emotion. "You were so brave, Sophie." "So were you. Dad told me about your meeting, about showing people your scars." "I did. It was scary, but it was freeing to stop hiding." Sophie considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "I think that's what being brave really is. Not pretending you're not scared, but doing the thing anyway. You and Dad are both really good at that." After Sophie drifted back to sleep, Evan and Claire stood by her bed and watched her breathe, watched the monitors track her newly repaired heart doing what it was supposed to do. "She's going to be okay," Claire whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. "She is, thanks to you. I didn't do anything. You paid for this. You made it possible." Claire shook her head. "The money doesn't matter. What matters is—" She stopped, seemed to struggle with something. "What matters is that I got to be here, that you let me be part of this, that for the first time in my life, I got to stay when things got hard instead of running away." Evan reached for her hand. "You know what I realized today? While I was waiting for her to get out of surgery?" "What?" That I love you, not because you paid for Sophie's surgery, not because you've been showing up for us. I love you because you're you, because you're fierce and broken and real, because you jumped into a river, literally and metaphorically, and you let me pull you out, because you're teaching my daughter that scars are just proof of survival. Claire's eyes filled with tears. I love you too. I didn't think I could. I didn't think I was capable of letting someone that close. But you and Sophie, you've been teaching me what staying looks like, what it means to choose someone and keep choosing them. So we keep choosing each other? Yeah, we keep choosing each other. They kissed there in the hospital room with Sophie sleeping peacefully beside them, and it felt like a promise. Not that things would always be easy, but that they'd face the hard things together. Sophie's recovery took 6 weeks. Claire rearranged her work schedule to be there for the appointments Evan couldn't make, showing up with books and games to distract Sophie from the tedium of healing. She learned Sophie's medication schedule, her dietary restrictions, the signs of complications to watch for. She became part of their daily routine in a way that felt inevitable, as if she'd always been meant to fit into the spaces between them. By March, Sophie was back to full activity, running and playing with an energy she'd never had before the surgery. Her heart was stronger now, stable in a way Dr. Patterson said could last years, maybe decades. She's going to live a relatively normal life, the doctor told Evan during a follow-up appointment. She'll always need monitoring, but this surgery bought her time, real time. Evan sat in his car after that appointment and cried with relief, with gratitude, with the overwhelming weight of love for his daughter who'd survived something that could have destroyed her. That evening, he took Sophie and Claire to the river, not the place where Claire had gone in, but upstream, where the water was calmer, where a small beach allowed access to the shallows. I haven't been swimming since I was 15, Claire said, staring at the water. Not since the scars fully healed, and I realized how people would stare. You don't have to, Evan said. We can just sit here. But Sophie was already pulling off her shoes, wading into the shallow water with a whoop of joy. It's cold! Dad, it's so cold! But it feels amazing! Claire watched her, something shifting in her expression. Then slowly, she began unbuttoning her shirt. Evan moved to give her privacy, but she caught his hand. No, stay. I need someone to see this, to see me choosing not to hide. She stripped down to her swimsuit, revealing the full extent of the scars that covered her left side, her shoulder, her arm, her ribs. In the late afternoon light, they were stark against her pale skin, a permanent map of survival. Sophie splashed closer, staring openly in the way children do. Claire, you're so brave. I can't believe you went in a river with scars like that. Weren't you scared people would see? Terrified. But your dad taught me something important. He taught me that being seen is worth the fear. Claire waded into the water, gasping at the cold, and Sophie grabbed her hand. Come on, I'll show you how to float on your back. It's the best. For the next hour, Evan watched them play in the shallows, his daughter and the woman he loved, both marked by scars, both proof that surviving made you stronger, not weaker. He took pictures on his phone, capturing moments of pure joy, of Sophie teaching Claire how to splash properly, of Claire laughing with her whole body in a way he'd never seen. When they finally emerged from the water, shivering and happy, Claire didn't immediately cover herself. She stood there in the fading light, water dripping from her scars, and lifted her face to the sun. I forgot, she said quietly. I forgot what this felt like. Being in my body without shame. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Evan and Claire sat on his apartment balcony under a blanket, watching the stars emerge over Ravenport. I've been thinking, Claire said, about the future, about what I want. And what do you want? This. You, Sophie. Not perfectly, not without complications, but real and messy and honest. She turned to face him. I want to stop living in that big empty penthouse alone. Evan, I want a family. With you. With Sophie. If you'll have me. Evan's heart did something complicated in his chest. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider, eventually, when it feels right, building something permanent together. Marriage, maybe. A life that's fully shared, not just borrowed time between crises. I would need to ask Sophie, Evan said slowly. She's part of this decision. Of course. I would never. She comes first, always. Then yes. Whenever you're ready, whenever we're ready, yes. Claire kissed him, soft and certain, and Evan felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for years. This was what coming home felt like. Not a place, but a person. Two people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing, even when it was hard. The proposal came 3 months later on a Saturday morning in June. Not grand or elaborate, just Evan and Claire and Sophie at the river's source, a place where the water bubbled up clear and cold from underground springs. Evan knelt in the shallow water, holding a ring he'd bought with money he'd saved from not having to pay the full surgery cost, from Claire's quiet insistence that her loan was forgiven, that it had never really been about repayment. Claire Whitmore, you jumped into my life when I wasn't looking for anyone. You showed me that letting people help isn't weakness, that being broken doesn't mean being less. You love my daughter like she's your own, so I'm asking, will you stay? Will you choose us, not just for now, but for always? Claire's hands were shaking as she pulled him up, kissed him while Sophie cheered in the background. Yes, yes, I'll stay. I'll always stay. The wedding happened in September, by the river where everything had started. Sophie was the flower girl, wearing a purple dress and carrying a basket of stones she'd collected specifically for the occasion, because even a wedding needed good rocks. Dr. Patterson attended, along with a handful of Evan's co-workers, some of Claire's colleagues, and a reporter who'd followed Claire's story and wanted to document this chapter. Claire wore a sleeveless dress that showed her scars without apology, and when she walked down the makeshift aisle, Evan saw her clearly, not as broken, not as damaged, but as exactly who she was supposed to be. They said their vows with their feet in the river, with Sophie standing between them holding both their hands. I promise to stay, Evan said, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promise to see you, all of you, and choose you anyway. I promise to let you, Claire said, to stop running when things get complicated, to believe that I'm worth staying for, to be the person Sophie and you deserve. And I promise, Sophie added, though it wasn't technically part of the ceremony, to show you my rock collection whenever you need to remember that broken things can still be beautiful. Later, at the small reception in Claire's penthouse, which now had Sophie's artwork on the walls and toys in the corners, which had transformed from empty showcase to actual home, Evan stood with his wife and daughter and felt the weight of the past 3 years lift slightly. Lauren would always be part of their story. The grief would always be there, a shadow that never fully disappeared. But grief could coexist with joy, with new love, with the family they were building from broken pieces. That night, after the guests had left and Sophie had fallen asleep in her new bedroom in the penthouse, Claire found Evan on the balcony. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling into his arms. "About that night at the river. About how I almost didn't jump in. I saw you fall and I thought about Sophie, about how I couldn't risk leaving her alone. But something made me go anyway." "What made you?" "I think maybe I knew, even then, that you needed someone to stay. And I needed someone to need me for something other than survival. We saved each other that night, Claire. You just didn't know it yet." She kissed his jaw, soft and sweet. "I know it now." A sound from Sophie's room made them both turn, not distress, just a small cry, the kind that came from dreams. Claire moved before Evan could, crossing to Sophie's bedroom and gently lifting the girl into bed with them, settling her between them like she'd been there all along. Sophie mumbled something about rocks and hearts and stayed, then burrowed deeper under the covers, her small body relaxed and safe between her father and the woman who'd chosen to become her family. Evan looked at Claire over Sophie's sleeping form and saw his whole world in that moment, past and present and future, grief and joy and hope all tangled together. "Thank you," he whispered, "for jumping in, for letting me pull you out, for staying." "Thank you," Claire whispered back, "for showing me what staying looks like, for teaching me that broken doesn't mean beyond repair." They fell asleep like that. 3 people who'd all survived impossible things, who'd all learned that scars were just proof you'd fought and won, who'd all discovered that the bravest thing you could do was let yourself be seen and loved anyway.
And in the morning, when Sophie woke them both too early with demands for pancakes and a detailed explanation of why the rock she'd found yesterday was objectively the best rock in her collection, they faced the new day together. Not perfectly, not without complications, but together. Which was, after all, the only thing that mattered. The river kept flowing past their windows, constant and unchanging, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. Three people who'd been drowning in different ways, who'd found each other in dark water and decided to keep swimming toward light. They'd chosen each other. They kept choosing each other. And that choice, renewed daily in small acts of presence and love and staying, was everything.